Hey, what's up, y'all? My name is Devontae, and I sacrifice my time so you don't have to. Okay, before I continue this, I'm gonna just say it outright. No, this is not coming from a place of sexism. No, this is not coming from a place of misogyny. I got nothing but love for the women, alright? In more ways than one, if you will. Okay, if you will. All I'm suggesting is the state of the business in multiple ways and multiple variables when you have to go directly to the women main eventing any kind of show. Not just main eventing the show, but if they're like the biggest star in your company, if they have the biggest story in your company, I think that's a huge indication as to where the business is currently going at that moment in time. It's not to say that the women don't bring anything to the table. It's not to suggest that I have anything against the women in themselves for doing their thing. In the end of the day, they're making their money. I got no problems with them making their paper. Strictly speaking on the healthiness of the business when you see things like that, right? Now, this is all stemming from the fact that AEW currently at the moment, I'm not sure if it's the main event. I hope it's not the main event, but apparently they're promoting the shit out of Hikaru Shida versus Sasha Banks later on tonight, right? Which, by the way, I will be reviewing Dynamite. And, you know, I see that and I think to myself, like, man, the state of professional wrestling is so shit right now, bruh. You know, and people are going to say, like, you again, Devontae, you're a fuddy-duddy. Devontae this, that, and if they're ad hominem this, ad hominem that, ad hominem this, ad hominem that. In the end of the day, professional wrestling at its healthiest is always going to be pertaining to adult man. Not just adult man, but stereotypically adult man with a beer in one hand, sitting with their buddies, hooting and hollering on their couch about some guy beating the shit out of the other guy. Professional wrestling is a male soap opera. Everything that happens in professional wrestling is supposed to be a balance of testosterone, and on the other side, a balance of drama. That's what it's supposed to be. In its own essence, that's what professional wrestling is. When you bring the women into the story, when you bring the women into the picture, and it's not something appealing to masculinity, if it's not something, I know people hate that word nowadays, I don't know what to tell you, man should be man, I mean, I never really understood the whole outlook of you have to have a soft man, because, I don't know, genetically speaking, the whole point of a man, from a DNA genetically speaking, how they were actually structured, was to be a protector, was to be a provider. They're supposed to be we're like biologically engineered to be bodyguards for the women, for the children, right? That's at least how I always looked at it from a scientific standpoint when you look throughout humanity, right? So why should we have to switch our perception all of a sudden to make it as if men have to be? Now, it's not to say that men can't be emotional. It's not to say that man can't go cry or anything. I'm not saying that. But to make that the image, to make that acceptable in the sense that that should be an everyday thing. A man should have a good cry. Just from an image standpoint, that just reduces man. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, I look at this whole structure and I look at the whole perception on how men are being looked at in society nowadays, and I think it's from the perception of the whole minority outlook of what is domineering and what is the victim, right? And I'm using all this as a context, as a structure, in order to paint out a picture as to what they're trying to implement in professional wrestling nowadays. I don't think it comes from the goodness of a person's heart to want to see women on an equal playing field as men. Because if that was the case, and I've been saying this for years now, you would be playing up to the women's, you know, the best thing that the women has to provide for the male gaze, for the male outlook, in a space that's dominated by men. And when you say things like this, it's just crazy to me that so many people take that and they look at it from a controversial lens, like, well, gosh darn it, what you're saying is so sexist and what you're saying is so horrible. I mean, but how? Why? Because you don't like it? Because it doesn't really include you within the space of whatever men are dominating at that moment? That's so bullshit, because we don't use that same logic when applying to women. Well, I take that back. We do use that logic when applying to women, when the victim hierarchy goes up in its stance, and then we bring into context, trans men and stuff like that, or trans women, right? Because we all know in the victim hierarchy, women are above men, but they're below trans women. So I look at this like, I guess the only way a man can actually have some type of, care in the world is, as far as the perception of society is considered, not obviously on an individual level, is to dress up as a woman, and then, they'll obviously usurp any woman out there, right? That's typically how it goes, right? But I bring this all up within the wrestling bubble and within the wrestling context, because like I said, I don't see it from the goodness of someone's heart to want to see women on par with men simply because you want equality. I don't look at it like that as far as how the other people look at it, right? As far as the women are considered who are participating in this, it makes all the sense in the world, right? Why would you actively go out of your way to fuck yourself over, right? If there's an opportunity for you as an individual to take advantage of this whole agenda being perpetuated on a larger, broader scale in professional wrestling or in society as a whole, for you to make more money, for you to have more opportunities, for you to have more advantages within whatever workspace you're working in at the moment, then by all rights, go for it. I'm not knocking you for it. It's no different than the lower tier stars in AEW getting so much money on their contracts. I can sit here all day and say that it's not deserved. That's obvious. But from an individual standpoint, you'd be a damn fool not to take advantage of it. Don't conflate those circumstances of me believing that that's a horrible fucking decision from a business standpoint and not think that you wouldn't be a complete fucking idiot not to take advantage of it. Two separate situations, two separate stances. But that has nothing to do, like I said, two separate stances that has nothing to do. Me telling you to not be an idiot and get the bag has nothing to do with me looking at the state of the wrestling industry, looking at the state of the wrestling business, and noticing that every time the women are on top, it's always at a down period, right? Or if it's not at a down period, it's bringing down the business along with it. Because at the end of the day, like I said, these people, they always create environments that they themselves don't want to live in. Kind of making a bit of a comparison, metaphor, not even a metaphor comparison, like an actual comparison. It's no different how you hear like in New York or California, you have all these people committing crimes, causing havoc and destruction, riots happening everywhere. Notice how you have so many socialists, they call them champagne socialists, right? Who go out of their way and they talk about the rights of the rights of the voices who are unheard, all this other stuff, right? And yet they're in a gated community. Yet they're surrounded by police officers. Yet they have private security. They're not in the slums of New York City. They're not in the bowels of Los Angeles having to go through the struggles of what everybody else is going through. There are actual people out there who are suffering from the decisions being made at the top from people who don't have to go through any of the stuff that they themselves legislate, that they themselves vote for, that they themselves go out of their way to want to perpetuate upon everybody, thinking in the end of the day that, hey, my virtue signal is going to make me look good in front of everybody, and that gives me a dopamine effect, right? Same thing can be said overall when it comes to people who always have a say on children, but they themselves don't have kids. In a wrestling context, you look at someone like a CM Punk, you talk about abortion rights, you talk about trans rights, but you have no fucking kids. You have no skin in the game. For people who consistently talk about all this other kind of stuff, like I said, they never have any skin in the game. And the same thing can be said about the women as far as the people who, for the most part, are on the outside looking in. See, you can say as much as you want, because this all stems off of politics whenever you look at how the women are being leveraged on television and stuff like that. How you want to see equality this, you want to see equality that, you want to see equality, but you don't watch professional wrestling. Typically, that's what you see with these wrestling activists, right? 9 times out of 10, they don't watch professional wrestling, right? And for the people who do watch professional wrestling, 9 times out of 10, the way they look at professional wrestling is nowhere near close to how the average person looks at professional wrestling. Now, you might get some type of, bivisual of how people will look at professional wrestling from the context of wrestling and from a character standpoint. People like me, for an example, right? I look at wrestling where I can appreciate it from the in-ring component, and I can morally or mostly appreciate it from a character standpoint, right? Promos, all that stuff, all the pumping circumstances that comes along with it. One may even say that usurps the in-ring stuff, right? But then you have people who can specifically look at just the in-ring action, right? So you have these two types of people who advocate for the women to be in the position that they're currently in, right? They're either people who don't care for professional wrestling overall, but they want to stick their nose within the business of professional wrestling. Very, 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 very similar to how you look at the video game industry, how you look at comic books and superhero movies. The same people who will call you nerds, call you geeks, call you losers for decades, now all of a sudden want to participate within nerd culture. You get what I'm saying? But at the same time, they don't know the first thing about the backstory or the history of whatever nerd culture or video game culture that you preside in. Look at people like Anna Sarkeesian, right? These are the kind of people who always have a voice in a situation but no skin in the game. People who perpetuate the stance of whether women should be in professional wrestling, they themselves are already indoctrinated, or at least their minds are already ingrained within the culture of the in-ring component that's been taking over professional wrestling for well over a decade, right? And then you look at the other aspect of the people, like I said earlier, who don't have any skin in the game and they don't watch professional wrestling. But look what happens all the time when you do things like this. What happens to the viewership number? What happens to the ratings? The culture of professional wrestling at that point in time in regards to whether or not you can engage with it properly. And what I mean by engage with it properly, I mean you can sit back, watch the show from top to bottom. See, historically, the women were always on the undercard. Historically, the women were a support system for whatever you want to put across on the card in itself. Typically, it came from sexual appeal. I've talked about this plenty of times for years now, and I'm always going to harp on it, and I'm always going to stay consistent with it. Because it's not to suggest that the women in themselves can't wrestle. It's to say that you take your best, not just from an in-ring component, but from a storyline standpoint. Can they talk on the microphone? What are their appeals outside of the sexiness? That in itself should coincide with how they actually look aesthetically. You know, you look at people like Rhea Ripley and Liv Morgan. They're a perfect example of women who aren't main eventing. They're a support on the card, and they're getting over very heavily. Why? Because the spotlight isn't strictly on them where they can be exposed so heavily. Look at Rhea Ripley and Nia Jax, one of the worst pay-per-view main events this entire year. It's so simple when you look at it and you actually stand back and you just on a broad scale look outside the field and see it for what it really is, right? It's propaganda used in order to make a person feel good about themselves rather than either a meritocracy in regards to the person who has earned the position, whether they're male or female. It should always be based off of who's the biggest draw in professional wrestling. I've always advocated for that. Not just the biggest draw, but the most consistent draw, whether that happens to be with appeal through monetary gain or whether that happens to be appeal through reaction, right? You shouldn't be forcing people in a spot strictly because of their sex or gender. That's ludicrous to me. You know, you go back, for an example, obviously, I think 2019 is the thing that stands out the most, right? And you take someone, for an example, like Becky Lynch. You take someone like a Ronda Rousey, for an example. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. WrestleMania 35 is by far, if not the worst main event in the history of professional wrestling. It is horrible. That was a dog shit triple threat match with a dog shit finish. Everything about that screamed mid-card. Everything about that screamed high-profile status. One may even want to say it should be on the marquee, but definitely not the main event of WrestleMania. You did it because people looked at it and they said to themselves, well, Becky Lynch, she's the most over babyface currently in your company, male or female, which is true. But historically, what does that mean overall? What does that mean? Because you have Ronda Rousey? What does that mean? Did you give that same acclamation to someone like a Undertaker and a Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 25? Did you do the same thing for Hulk Hogan and The Rock at WrestleMania X8? Did you do the same thing for Bret and Austin at WrestleMania 13? No, you didn't do any of those things when you probably should have done those things. Why? Because you had the common sense and the perception to look at the broader scale of everything outwardly going on, and you said to yourself, well, gosh darn it. Right there is what we've been building up for months now. That right there, with the exception of WrestleMania 13, one should definitely make an argument that Bret and Austin, there was no excuses as to why that was the main event, because Sid and Taker had no build to it whatsoever for the most part. But like I said, situations happen. Things were happening backstage with Shawn Michaels being a prick and then everything. Long story. You know how that story goes at WrestleMania 13 and the build to it. That's the exception, not the rule. But yet, when we get to WrestleMania 35 and you look at Becky, you look at Ronda, why? Why didn't you go out of your way to build someone up to a position where they themselves could have main evented WrestleMania, and that could have been a penultimate to help build up the card? Some argue that Bryan Danielson and Kofi Kingston, maybe they should have main evented WrestleMania, considering the story that they had. But you didn't do it. You had to go with Becky, and you had to go with Ronda Rousey. And to make matters much worse, you shoehorned Charlotte Flair into all of that, just to show you how indebted they are into the whole gender bullshit. You think they want to present Charlotte Flair as one of the greatest women wrestlers of all time? No, they want to present her as one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. That's why they forced her into that WrestleMania spot, because they knew there's no other way they can get Charlotte into a spot like that without forcing her into one of the hotter feuds within the company at that point in time. But like I said, it's all an agenda in the end of the day. The women's revolution as a whole has been nothing but a stain on the wrestling business. It has its goods, but god damn it, does it have its bads. And the bads completely outweigh the good. You have tag team championship belts for the women that no one gives a dog shit about, right? You have women up and down the fucking card on there for the sake of being on there with no presence, no reaction, and one can say to themselves, well, Devontae, maybe someone like a Triple H could do a better job getting these women over. Why should he? Why should that even have to be a thought in someone's mind when you look at, for the most part, what professional wrestling was built upon? I said it once and I'll say it again. You know why people remember Sunny? You know why people remember Sable? You know why people remember Trish? You know why people remember Lita? It's because they got over on sexual appeal first. The wrestling always came secondary, right? At least in the case of Lita and Trish. It always came secondary, the wrestling. We wanted to actually see their bodies because they're women and they're in a male-dominated environment. We want to see their bodies. I see nothing wrong with that. I say, why? Why the fuck do we have to run up the hill, running, screaming, crying, and moaning, bitching, and groaning, all about that, right? You have actual women who participate within the business in themselves who legitimately wanted to be divas. Summer Rae comes to mind, obviously. You know, people like, I just seen not too long ago, maybe it can just be a gimmick or whatever, but I seen Washington talking about bringing back the Divas Championship. Fucking Zack Ryder's girlfriend, whatever the fuck her name, Chelsea Green. You know, multiple women actually do come into the business wanting to make the most money humanly possible, getting over, and everybody wins. But no, we take away that because women power, feminist power. Put your fist up in the air. And you take away so much from so many people because you feel this right here isn't just the virtuous thing to do, it's the right thing to do. You know, growing up, conservatives and the Republicans were all about restricting women's rights as far as wanting to, be more sexually appealing, if you will, right? More promiscuity, right? That was the whole thing. You know, it was all based off of religion and whatnot, but that was the big crux of everybody's problem when looking at Republicans back in the days, where that they were just so indebted within the religious aspect of how everybody should be living that we don't need to be seeing sexual promiscuity. We don't be needing to see any of the fucking innuendos or any of the things that make being a teenager cool, for an example, right? And it was the left that opposed all of that. The left still opposed that. They just have selective opposition to whatever they want to put across. That's what I mean. You see, you can go on Instagram all day. You can go on Twitter. You can go on any of the social media pages. Hell, WWE's pick of the week is almost exclusively women half naked in their pictures. Why is it so bad to take that and put it on television? Can anyone tell me? I think that in itself has more of a selling ability than anything having to do with the wrestling. And if anything, it sells the wrestling. And if anything, that in itself, not just the wrestling, brings more eyeballs to the television that get more women over. You see, it's funny. The so-called perverts and the so-called degenerates have the women more at heart as far as thinking what's best for them on the television programming than the people who want to pretend to not be degenerates and perverts, right? The people with the anime pictures, the soy boys, the tip of the hat miladies, the beards falling all the way down to their balls, pretending they're virtuous, the nice guys, if you will, right? Because almost never exclusively do you see women talking about this outside of the women wrestlers in themselves, because almost all of them are feminists. Almost exclusively outside of that, it's the men following the women with the feminist ideology who want to promote this, knowing good and damn well they don't think like this, knowing good and damn well that's not how they get down. So then you get a culture of what we see in professional wrestling currently at the moment, right? You get what we have on AEW tonight. Not saying that Hikaru Shida or Mercedes Moné is going to main event, but it's that mindset that perpetuates people outcry, having rage, upset, that if this match probably doesn't main event, it should have main evented. It's the reason why Sasha Banks is given $5 million for a contract she doesn't deserve. Like I said, she should get the bag. She'd be a dumb fuck not to get the bag. But for the people who put her into a position to have the mindset to believe she deserves that bag, well, I wonder why. See, you can call me a sexist, a misogynist. We're coming back full circle now. You can say all these names and say all these things you want to say about me. Is it not true that the wrestling business typically, it dips not only just, metrically, but just the enthusiasm for the product when a woman is on top? No pun intended. Do you see the women as organically being in that position today? You see, when I think organically, I think Lita and Trish, right? That's organic. Fans naturally got behind them. They naturally got the positions that they got. And how did they get the positions that they got naturally before they actually started to wrestle on a consistent basis? Sex appeal that we actively deny, even though the women do it on a consistent basis outside of professional wrestling in regards to the Instagrams and the social medias. You see, you can get upset at the things that I'm currently saying at the moment, but nothing I'm saying is factually untrue, right? You may call it subjective, if you will, but subjectivity rooted in facts, subjectivity rooted in objectiveness. You yourself may not want to see it, but at the same time, I call bullshit and I say that you do want to see it. You just don't want to be called a pervert. Newsflash, you're still a pervert. And it's okay. Because like everything in society nowadays, the meaning of words no longer mean what it originally meant. And for the things that are super mundane and insignificant, is blown completely out of proportion to make you look like a monster and make them look like a victim. Always keep that in mind. Professional wrestling was never built. Professional wrestling will never survive on the foundation of social justice and equity. Masculine, toxic masculinity, beards, grrr, and women being damsels in distress, women playing their part as far as sexual promiscuity is considered, say what you will, is forever going to be the stereotype in professional wrestling. Whether you're looking at from a Miss Elizabeth standpoint or if you're looking at it from a Sable standpoint. That's how they'll forever get over. That's how they'll forever be seen. And the more you get away from that, the more professional wrestling starts to dwindle. Hate me all you want to. I'm not stating things to piss people off. I'm stating things to bring you back to reality. I'll be back later on tonight for the Dynamite review. Or if you're watching this in the future, well, go through my playlist and shut the fuck up. I don't know. Let me get the fuck up out of here. I'll be catching you guys later. A deuces and a P eyes.